All right, everyone. Thank you guys so much, all of you, for coming. I'm really excited about this event. I think it's going to be really interesting. My name is Patrick Buckley. I'm a student at SUNY Geneseo, and I'm running this project through a really generous donation by an alumni of Geneseo, James Houston. So I just want to get that out of the way. It was a really generous donation. I've been provided many different resources to the Center for Inquiry, Discovery, and Development. I have so many people to thank for this event. I can't name them all tonight, but I just want to put it under the umbrella of the CIDD. It's a really amazing program. So we have Dr. Sara Burch. Thank you so much for coming. She'll be talking about understanding the biology of extinct animals. So thank you so much.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. So during this first part, I'm just going to give you some background, how we understand about animals. This is a fairly kind of informal event. Jump in, ask questions. Don't feel like you got to hold them till the end, anything like that. So I said distinct animals, but I primarily study dinosaurs. So dinosaurs, what we have the bones, right? So everyone knows we have these big dinosaur bones. Sometimes, if we're lucky, we have the whole skeleton. But what we really end up wanting, and what's a big part of popular culture, is what they actually looked like, right? How they acted, how they were. No one just wants to look at bones. People want to look at whole dinosaurs. So the main thing is, like, how do we take this pile of bones and turn it into something that is an animal, a really living, breathing animal? How it lived. And our ideas and how we've done this has changed drastically over the centuries. So in the very first, when dinosaurs were first discovered, people thought they looked a lot like this. This was one of the first dinosaurs ever discovered. In the middle of the 1900s, 1942-ish, the classic dinosaur was your lumbering, slow giant, very slow and kind of not that dynamic. Today, our idea of dinosaurs is really different. So how did we get from here to there? That's a huge change. So the first transition is basically a matter of just how many fossils we have. So when they found the first dinosaurs, this is all they had of this animal. This jaw with a tooth. So it's just a lower jaw with one tooth sticking out of it. And so they said, well, it looks kind of like a big reptile. It's clearly eating meat. It's got like a big steak knife tooth. Well, maybe it looked something like that. I don't know. They were pretty creative. Then they found, over time, whole skeletons of these animals. It became obvious that, okay, this is how these things kind of look. You have skull. It's pretty straightforward. But at the same time, when they found these animals, they're like, okay, these are reptiles. Reptiles are slow, so they must have been big and slow. And how could they possibly support these huge bodies on two legs? Surely they used their tail as a tripod. So kind of just ideas of the time that these things had to be fairly slow moving. Now, when we go from here to here, a lot of this isn't just more new fossils. Sometimes it's more new fossils, but a lot of times it's looking at the same fossils we already had and really reevaluating it. Where does this transition come from? It's an understanding of how the animals were put together, how the bones really went together, and how these animals, their lifestyles. So this transition is a little less straightforward, and I want to talk about this transition today and how we kind of got from here to here. and how we know that dinosaurs look more like that than this. So when you're doing paleontology, you make a lot of modern comparisons. A lot of people think paleontology, you just study the old dead things. Most paleontologists study living animals too. And that's because when you look at an extinct animal, if you can compare it to one that's alive, you can make a lot more and better inferences about what it lived like and what it looked like. Sometimes this is easy. So if you find a giant crocodile, looks like a modern crocodile, it's probably doing the same thing that a modern crocodile is. That's pretty straightforward. And these two things are pretty closely related. They're both crocodiles, right? They're the same kind of animal. Sometimes it's kind of seems obvious, but they're two animals that are not closely related at all. So an example is this guy here. So this is an animal called an ichthyosaur. It's a marine reptile, so it's a reptile in the sea. And their shape and kind of how they're put together with their fins looks a lot like a dolphin. So a lot of the inferences on what ichthyosaurs were like as how they lived is based on dolphins. Even though dolphins are mammals and these are reptiles, and they could not be like more distantly related. They are really far apart. So because they're so similar in overall shape, we have a better idea. It's a one-to-one match. Early paleontologists did this too. So this is not just something that we do today. You take what you find and you compare it to the current animals that you know about. So this were the teeth that the dinosaur called Iguanodon. And when Gideon Mantell described this dinosaur in 1822, he thought these teeth looked like iguana teeth. And so he made this little drawing, or someone made this drawing, of what this thing might have looked like. It had a few bones of it too. It looked kind of like, so here's a picture of an iguana's tooth. It's got kind of this leafy shape, if you can see. It's not too different from these teeth up here. He thought it must be a giant iguana. So this is the kind of thing that they did. Now, again, this is maybe more of a sample type thing. So like, he only had these teeth and a couple bones. So he didn't know a lot about how the rest of the dinosaur looked. Today, it looks really different, but at the time, he was going with what he had, and we still do that a lot today. Sometimes our ideas change rapidly in the last few times. Yeah.
I just have a quick question about like this whole comparing modern day animals to past animals. In the previous slide, you had like colored pictures of ancient animals. So do we know that those are the same colors, or is it the same
color.
kind of thing?
So actually, I'm going to talk about some colors a little later, and how we are starting to learn a little bit about the color of past animals. But for the most part, that's just artistic license. And so, for instance, in this one, this artist colored it just like a crocodile because it's a crocodile. So, I mean, we don't know that it looked like that, but it's probably pretty straightforward. And, oops, I went the wrong way. These guys are colored like dolphins, not because we know that they're colored like dolphins, but because we infer that they looked like dolphins, so maybe they were colored like dolphins too. So it's kind of, the color thing is actually part of that inference. Like, you gotta pick a color, usually you base it on some kind of living animal. All right, so they did that. But now we have these whole skeletons of dinosaurs, and these things don't look like anything that's alive today. So each of these things as a whole, what could you compare this to? And so it becomes maybe a little harder. The key here is breaking things down by parts. So say we have this sauropod, Alamosaurus, and we want to know about what it moved like, how it's held its body. A lot of people study sauropod legs and how they walked by looking at elephants. So you look at the biggest animal we have on land today, and you say, maybe we can scale this up. So some of the early sauropods, before they started thinking about, oh, maybe they're like elephants, they thought they couldn't support their weight on land. They were too big. They had to be in the water. But when you actually look at the bones in their legs and their upper limbs, they are put together not unlike elephants. So even though elephants are not closely related to dinosaurs, you can use an elephant to understand how these dinosaurs might have walked. And this over here is a picture of a scientist taking motion data on an elephant. So he's actually capturing how this elephant is moving, how the joints are moving at different gaits, so that we can understand about how elephants move better, and they can help us understand about dinosaurs. So that's actually another component of this, is that it turns out that a lot of times we don't know much about modern animals, even though they live all around us. And so a lot of this is actually going in and figuring out how the modern animals work, and then you can go back and apply it to the extinct ones. So that's a lot of that research too. So another part of Elmosaurus, maybe you could separate out, is the neck. So necks, really long. What has a long neck? Giraffes have a long neck. So various things related to the muscles and the ligaments that hold the neck up could possibly be related to how this dinosaur could hold its neck up. Research related to how giraffes supply their head with blood is important for sauropods, right? You have a heart that's way back here and a brain that's way up here. You got to get blood back and forth somehow, but you don't want too much blood to come in, and that's the same thing that giraffes face. They have a big old heart, they have a brain up here and really long arteries, and they have to make sure they get enough blood up to the brain, but they also have to make sure that not too much blood comes down when they're have their heads down, so taking a drink or something like that. So a lot of this is kind of breaking down these animals into things where we can say, okay, how does this, what does this look like if we just focus in on this part, right? So you kind of have to get a little finer scale. Another example is like all of these things are basically related to Triceratops, which is on here somewhere, although I don't know where. And so they're all a group of dinosaurs called ceratopsians, and they all have this huge diversity of horns and frills and things like that. And so you can say, what did they do with these? Again, we look to modern animals. So modern animals use showy structures like a big frill, and in this case feathers, to display for a mate. Perhaps this is something to do with mates. Especially, again, we don't know anything about these colors, artistic license, but if it's a showy display structure, maybe it was really colorful. We know that animals use horns and antlers to battle each other for a mate, so this kind of within a species, they battle each other, and they can use them for defense as well. And part of kind of this type of science is making these ideas and then coming up with ways to test them. So it's hard to test this. You can kind of say, well, maybe it was display, but it's really hard to say if it was really display or not. But things like this could be actually tested if you look at the strength of the horns. Were they good at combat? You know, was this something that would be possible? And some of these frills are really delicate. It's just very fine bone. So you think, well, maybe the frill doesn't have anything to do with defense or fighting, but the frill body is the display structure. So you kind of have to go into that type of thing. So to show you a little bit about how we look at some of these things in cases where we have no good modern animals that are examples. So sometimes we get really fine scale and we say, okay, can we just figure out what, say, the muscles of this dinosaur looked like? Because if we know what the muscles look like, maybe we can tell what it was doing. So this type of science uses the modern animals that are closely related to dinosaurs. So this case, crocodiles are a pretty closely related, this is like a dinosaur family tree here. Here's our dinosaurs. Crocodiles, pretty closely related to dinosaurs, so we look at their muscles. On the other side, birds are actually very closely related to dinosaurs. In fact, they are the modern descendants of dinosaurs. So we look at their muscles, and we compare these two muscles, and we say, what does the dinosaur muscle look like? This is super common if we want to be able to test functionally kind of what these dinosaurs were capable of. So it's used in all kinds of locomotion studies, so how the dinosaurs ran, and this is an example of one where they actually put it in a 3D model and made it run by kind of making the muscles contract. So what kind of speed could this dinosaur do? There can look at things like forelimb function, which is actually my major research. It doesn't have to be muscles. Looking at modern animals and modern, this type of evolutionary inference can tell us a lot about how dinosaurs breathed. So these are basically parts of the lungs of the dinosaurs and kind of comparing them to birds. And a really big one is biting and how hard they could bite and what maybe they could eat. It's a really big area where people look at these muscles and they say, okay, now that we know what the muscles look like, how hard could this dinosaur bite? Could we model this? And most of the time they can. There are a lot of unanswered questions still and a lot of controversy in paleobiology today. Things like, was Tyrannosaurus Rex feathered? So this pops up in the news now pretty commonly. Because, as I'll talk to you in a minute, feathers are now seemingly part of all kinds of dinosaurs. So was T-Rex feathered, or maybe just baby T-Rexes were feathered? So sometimes baby birds covered it down, maybe baby T-Rexes, maybe they lost feathers when they got really big. It's kind of up in the air. And as we find fossils, as we understand more about these animals, it kind of goes back and forth. Another kind of controversy area of continuing research right now is whether, so there's all of these maybe look like birds, but they're not. They're actually dinosaurs they're definitely not birds, but they do have wings. So they have wings, but could they actually fly? Or did they just glide? This is a big controversy and something that's constantly being kind of tested today. And I want to talk you through a few examples of just some of the things that are kind of ongoing and really the hot new things right now, the areas of most controversy. So for instance, I'm just going to kind of throw these guys up here. Turns out that feathery structures are kind of part of many, many dinosaurs. So this is the whole dinosaur family tree here. And here's birds right here called ABs. But you have these other dinosaurs that are actually not that closely related to birds. Some of them are, but some of them aren't. They have feathery structures. So how far back did all dinosaurs potentially have feathers? We don't know yet. Maybe. Maybe at some point in their life. Maybe some of them did, some of them didn't. It's hard to say. So was an early dinosaur ancestor actually feathered? Coloration. So here's our new emerging field of coloration. We used to say there's no way we'll ever be able to tell what color things are in the past, and that's not true. Turns out if you look at these fossils under a really high microscope, you can actually see the individual little cells that cause them to be different colors. And so here's a fossil feather and a recent feather. They look the same when you put them underneath electron microscope. We can tell whether things are striped. We can tell, in fact, red happens to be one of the few colors that at this point we can tell. We can tell if something was red or not. You can also tell if it's black. Red and black we have. Other colors might take some more years of research to figure out how to identify them. Another thing we can ID is iridescence. So you see the glossy birds that look black, but then in certain lights they're kind of bluish, purplish, greenish. we can actually ID iridescence. And there's this dinosaur here called Microraptor, has iridescent black glossy feathers. It was like a very beautiful glossy black freckle or something like that. So that's what this, when you have this type of paleo art, this is actually a color that we know this dinosaur had. And same with these. They were red, they had stripes on their tails. We know this now. So why feathers? Dinosaurs didn't evolve feathers for flying. Feathers came first as probably a way to keep warm. So these are some heat pictures of birds, and you can see that feathers, where they don't have feathers, like in the face of this chicken, it's really bright white, which means there's a lot of heat being lost. But where there are feathers, they're nice insulating. There's not heat being lost there. So some dinosaurs lived in very cold climates where it probably snowed. And so now we know that some of these dinosaurs, even the big ones, had these feathers, probably to keep warm. That is related to metabolism. So probably you've heard of the cold-blooded, warm-blooded thing with dinosaurs. Were they cold-blooded? Were they warm-blooded? Somewhere in between is probably the answer for the majority. Depends on how big you are. So a lot of dinosaurs plot, when you kind of look at their metabolic rate, they plot in the middle. Here's the endotherms, mammals, birds, things that are warm-blooded. Here's our ectotherms, crocodiles, lizards. Here's the dinosaurs, and actually great white sharks also fall into this category. They're the middle ground. But some of these really bird-like dinosaurs were probably more up on that endothermic end, and some of the big dinosaurs have this kind of crazy way. They're so big they just hold on to their heat. They don't actually need to generate it. They're just big enough to hold on to it forever. So this feathers probably is related to wanting to keep your temperatures more stable, so not being so cold-blooded anymore. Dinosaur growth is a big emerging area. You can take a small, thin section of a dinosaur bone and count the rings, like the rings of a tree, see how fast it grew. So, for instance, this graph shows the growth of an alligator. It's pretty slow and gradual. And this one shows growth rate of an ostrich, goes kind of straight up and then is flat. So they grow really super fast. Turns out dinosaurs somewhere in between in some cases, but then this guy here, this is a T-Rex. You can see this goes pretty straight up and down. So this T-Rex probably grew really fast. So maybe it's growing much more like a bird. And that can have implications for things like warm-bloodedness too. And I kind of mentioned, could they fly or not? So understanding whether they could actually flap like a bird and fly versus gliding is something that's undergoing a lot of research. People make models in real life and digitally and put them in wind tunnels and say, could they fly? Could they glide in certain positions? Things like that. So kind of figuring out what the best aerodynamic area, how aerodynamic these wings really are. They're not true full wings. They're kind of like, some of them are like half a wing. So like, what can you do with half a wing? So this is part of kind of that research. And another kind of interesting thing about dinosaur flight, so birds have all these big flight muscles. You just had Thanksgiving, right? So Thanksgiving turkey has that big breastbone with the big keel that sticks up in the middle. Take the breast meat out off of either side, you have the big keel. Those are the flying muscles. Even though that turkey wasn't flying, those are the flying muscles, that breast meat. Birds have huge flying muscles. But dinosaurs, they don't have that keel. They don't have an area to put huge flying muscles. So does that preclude them from flapping? Well, not necessarily. Bats don't have a giant keel and they flap, so maybe we need to study how bats fly to understand how dinosaurs fly. And this could be, I don't think anyone's doing this right now, But I think it could be an interesting way to kind of look forward at flight and dinosaurs and things like that. All right, so just to kind of wrap up this part, this was our view of like 70 years ago, and today we have a much more dynamic view of these things. It's constantly changing. Again, feathers, that has rapidly changed in the last 20 years. So like in the 90s, everyone thought there's no feathers on any dinosaurs, and now there's feathers on all kinds of dinosaurs. So, you know, we're really rapidly growing and changing. It's because of all of this different, this avenues of research going on. So I'm going to stop that part here and do questions and things like that, and then we'll do another little activity thing towards the end. All right, so questions? Yeah.
Other than curiosity and look for knowledge, which I'm all for,
Yep.
what does keep learning all this buy us?
Right, so the main thing here has to do with understanding how ancient animals dealt with each other, dealt with their environment, how they lived, how they died, and that actually comes in a lot to how they dealt with extinction. So, for instance, one of the things that we know about dinosaurs, many of them died at this big catastrophic extinction at the end of Mesozoic. But there was a bunch of them who didn't. Now they are birds. So what was it about those birds and bird-like dinosaurs that made them able to survive that extinction when the other ones couldn't? And so by understanding about the biology of both of these types of dinosaurs and things like that, we have a better idea of how extinction impacts an animal. And then we can take that and say, okay, how is our current extinctions, because there's a lot of extinctions going on today, how do they impact our animals that are alive today? Can we expect these types of animals to survive an extinction where the earth warms or cools by a large amount? Well, we can have a better idea of that if we know how that extinction dealt with the previous animals too. So that's kind of a big thing, is kind of understanding our current situation and how we're going through these ecological changes by understanding all of these past ones that have already happened. So we kind of have a little view on what the future could hold. Yeah.
So you mentioned some research that you've done. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so a lot of my research has to do with a kind of very specific part of this, which is about what dinosaurs were doing with their forelimbs, so their upper limbs. And those specifically the dinosaurs that I'm looking at are the ones that ran around on two legs. So they weren't using their forelimbs for running on. And I've mostly not focused on the ones that might be flying at that point. So I kind of use the ones that aren't running and aren't flying. So what are they doing with their limbs? And so a lot of my research focuses on what could they possibly be doing, testing out different kind of prey capture maybe hypotheses. I look at is there like signs of whether a dinosaur could take a big prey item, or was it maybe going to grab a small prey item, things like that. So that's a lot of my research, is like, how did these limbs evolve? Yeah.
How did you get interested in doing that research? Like, what led you to that?
So that research, I went to grad school to study dinosaurs, and was kind of thinking about what I wanted to look at, and my advisor at the time was like, I have this dinosaur, so he did all of this research in Madagascar, actually. So this dinosaur from Madagascar, and it has these really super tiny arms. So like, we're talking way smaller than T-Rex arms. This is a super tiny arm, and they're really weird looking too. And he's like, why don't you try to figure out what this dinosaur might have been doing with these arms? Or, you know, what, and actually I had been doing, even as an undergrad, I did some research on dinosaur forelimbs. that was another thing where it was just kind of like, here's a project. But then it kind of grew out of that, where it was like, this is really fascinating, kind of started looking at not just that dinosaur, but all of the dinosaurs that have tiny arms, and then all of the dinosaurs in general, and things like that. So it just kind of expanded out from there. Yeah?
On your slide with the Triceratops and the different subspecies of
Yeah.
Triceratops, like how did they determine that,
I'll just
There
put it
were
up
so
we can
many-
look at it.
how did they determine that there were so many different subspecies? Was that DNA sequencing? That
So
they-
these are actually not even just subspecies, they're not even different species, they're the next level up, what we could call a different genus. There's not DNA from these guys, at least not enough to do any kind of sequencing, but in a case like this, where you're kind of dealing with such extreme variation, a lot of times, okay, it's fairly straightforward for people to say, these are two different species. And then there's the variation that you don't even see, but people who stare at these skulls all day, every day, they see. And there's this deep variation within the brain case, so like how the part of the head that doesn't stick out, that's not obvious, but it's shaped dramatically different in two different species, two different genera. So, part of the reason that we know these are all different, some of these guys lived millions and millions of years apart in time, so that's also points to probably different species, drastically different parts of the world, things like that, that we can kind of separate them out. Another thing about this kind of crazy displays and stuff like that is that a lot of the display structures that animals have can also be used for species recognition. So that's another animal recognizing you because you have the same shape of horns that they do. So in that case, you wouldn't want a huge variety in horn shapes among one species. You would want, these guys have this horn, these guys have these horns. They don't breed because they know that they're not the same species. They don't recognize the difference in horns. There are people who argue that some of the animals that don't have as elaborate of horns or things like that, there's kind of two parts of this. Sometimes people try to argue that there's what we call sexual dimorphism, which is that the females would have not as elaborate of horns and the males would have elaborate horns. Although that's a little less common with these guys than some other dinosaurs. Sometimes people try to argue that they are just different ages of the same dinosaur. So that one is a younger dinosaur, hasn't developed all of its crazy that's a thing that's just people go back and forth with all the time. Sometimes, you know, we might never 100% know, and sometimes we kind of, oh, okay, yeah, we find enough fossils that we start seeing maybe this is true, maybe they are different ages. Or no, these are very distinct animals, so it's kind of how you figure out how a different species is. Oh, yeah.
But you came up with all those based on actual fossils?
Yeah, well, these are all
None of those
fossils.
were just inferences from other pieces?
Nope, these are all different genera. These are different species of ceratopsians that have been found. They exist in the world. None of these are made up. As wild as some of them are, yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about the size of them? I mean, most of the time when I watch the movies, they have to be like 3 times the size of me and Golden.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that most dinosaurs weren't that big, but I keep wondering if they were made from mineral deposits and you just layered on another mineral deposit and another one and another one, could we overguess how big they were from how big they were to begin with?
I don't think we would ever overguess because a lot of that bone that we get is basically what happens when a bone gets fossilized. You just get this one mineral comes in and replaces like this one cell. And that's why we get those like crazy bird feathers where you get a cell that's like a melanosome that is preserved because this is micro scale mineral replacement. And some of them aren't actually replaced at all. So you get this very, very fine scale replacement. So like we kind of, from various trials and stuff, we kind of know that the fossilization is reasonably true to size/shape. In fact, most of the time, if something is going to be changed, it's going to be crushed and it's going to be smaller than what we think it should be. Now, how big were these things? Huge range, from dinosaurs that were like size of a sparrow to dinosaurs that were bigger than you can possibly imagine. So some of these big sauropods had just their thigh bone was like over 6 feet tall, and like that's just the thigh, so that's dealing with like just truly massive animal. These guys, some of these guys, if you ever go to a natural history museum, look for a Triceratops head. They're massive. They're like at least this wide in the frill and like this long. I don't know how anyone studies them because you can't turn them over. They're just so big. I work on little things, little tiny arms. Yeah.
So besides like arms, which you're clearly really
Yep.
fascinated with, is there anything that like, is there anything that like you wish people would ask you about, like so you could talk about it for like 10 hours, or, I mean.
Not really. Yeah, I mean, like a lot of the stuff that, you know, I kind of cherry picked all the stuff that I find particularly interesting for this talk anyway. There's all kinds of other stuff that goes on. Yeah, there's just so much. It's interesting to go in different ways. Like just when I was preparing for this talk, I was looking up bat muscles and like the bat thing. And I had talked about bats before, but I was like, I want a picture of like a bat sternum as an example. I was looking how the bat muscles are differently arranged so that they can do a different upstroke, downstroke, and they like emphasize different muscles. I was thinking, that would be so interesting to see if we could tell if these dinosaurs that had wings actually emphasized, they were like more bat muscle arrangement than the bird muscle arrangement. Like that would be real, and I look at forelimb muscles, so I was like, that would be really cool, like maybe I should do that. So like, it's interesting to kind of like go through some of these things and like get new ideas, yeah.
So, when we go to natural history museums, I'm kind of thinking about, you know, field trips I took as a kid.
Yeah.
You know, I grew up in Pittsburgh, at the Carnegie Museum. How much are those museums kind of actively studying and changing those displays that
So,
they had? I mean, is it constantly
Not
moving?
super frequently. Every once in a while, a museum gets a good amount of money and they revamp all the displays. So currently, the Smithsonian in DC, all the dinosaur galleries are closed because they're undergoing like a 5-year renovation to completely update all their dinosaur galleries. They're taking everything down, they're gonna remount all the skeletons, they're gonna put up all this new information, which is gonna be out of date in 10 years. But you know, like, there's certain things like, you know, if you are looking for the most up-to-date information, then find a museum that has just redone its dinosaur hall. Because that is usually, you know, there's a curator there who is going through and making sure, okay, this is, you know, this has been studied a lot, we are pretty sure about this, you know, this is good information. So you have people who are really the experts who are kind of making sure that that's what makes it into the displays. So then like, there's various other places, just like there's Salt Lake City, the Utah Museum of Natural History just did its, it moved and had new displays in the last 5 years, gorgeous and really up to date. So it just kind of depends on when the last time they updated things was.
So where do researchers go? I mean, is it, they just have specimens in their lab? Is it in the field?
Well, so it depends. There's a lot of different ways to be a paleontologist. Museum curator, one of those ways. So those people have like their museum. They do research there. University professor is another way. Those people, like me, go to museums to look at the fossils that are stored there. And then any kind of paleontologist can participate in field work, where you go out in the field and collect new fossils. Now, that they have to be, we call reposited somewhere that is like a real museum. So you can't just go out and collect dinosaur fossils. You need the permits, the permissions, things like that, and part of that is making sure that they have a home that is appropriate. So they have a museum that they will be curated at, and they'll be protected, and that people can go and see them to study them. Because part of science is making sure that if people want to come look at your dinosaur, because they want to repeat your experiment or they want to look at and check what you published, that they can do so. So that's a big part, is making sure it's publicly available for any scientist who wants to go look at it. Yeah,
Maybe this could be our last question before our activity, but did you like dinosaurs as a kid?
yes. Yes, I am a person who always wanted to be a paleontologist when I grew up. Then it happened, so. All right, so, yeah.
Can you watch dinosaur movies anymore?
Depends. So sometimes, sometimes it's like, I grew up, like when I was a young child, Jurassic Park came out, and so it's like you can always go back and watch Jurassic Park even though it's like science is a little dated. It makes it harder to go watch things like Jurassic World and the new ones that come out, because you're like, that's ridiculous. All right, so how did dinosaurs care for their young? I want to kind of take you guys through. I'm gonna ask you to kind of think about to be a paleontologist for a little bit and figure out how did dinosaurs care for the young. So I'm going to give you all the evidence that that other paleontologists have and ask you to make inferences, to make comparisons to modern animals, to figure out what was going on. So imagine, if you will, that you are a member of expedition of Roy Chapman Andrews in Mongolia. So this, Roy Chapman Andrews, very dashing and adventurous fellow. The tale is that Indiana Jones is in part based on Roy Chapman Andrews. Whether that's true or not is another matter. But he went to Mongolia, and he and his team found a huge number of dinosaur nests. They found all of these nests full of eggs. So the first piece of evidence here is a picture of one of the sites, and each of these little red dots is a nest. So we have a lot of dinosaur nests, and they're all like in the same area, they're all in the same level, so they're probably all, or they might have all been there at the same time. This is another kind of map here where you can see all the different nests in this thing. So here's one piece of evidence. We have all these nests, and they are kind of, there's a bunch of them near each other. So the nests kind of looked like these. There's two different nests here. And then you also find this specimen. This specimen appears to be a dinosaur that is over the top of a nest. So here's some nests, some eggs here. There's a dinosaur, there's a nest. They were preserved together. So it probably means a big sandstorm, dune, something came and buried it right as it was over the top of the nest. You put the dinosaur together, it looks something like that. So you have a dinosaur, it's a predatory dinosaur. It's in two legs, it's got these big long hands, it's got a beak, so there's your dinosaur. Now I'm going to give you some information about the modern animals, in case you're not super familiar with all of their nesting activities. So I told you birds and crocodiles are two brackets for dinosaurs. How do birds and crocodiles care for their young? You probably know that birds sit on their nests and protect them, and that includes things that nest on, or most birds. Things like ostriches, they nest on the ground, so these were on the ground. So here's an ostrich sitting on a nest. Crocodiles, here's our other side of our evolutionary tree. turns out they also protect their nest. They will protect it as the babies are growing, so as it's in a mound. And then when the babies start to hatch, mother crocodile comes, gathers up all her babies, protects them as they are starting to grow. Other things that can happen around nests. Things can come eat eggs out of nests. So other reasons animals could have to be around nests is that sometimes animals come to steal an egg. Eggs are yummy, right? So like, you want to get. And then to think about what kind of nesting could this be? Some animals nest by themselves. Some animals nest in large colonies. So there's a bunch of seabirds, and you can see each of those mounds, each of those birds, that's a nest. So this is all your information on our modern animals, on your dinosaur. So I just want to kind of like throw out, you can kind of take a couple minutes, just think about it, chat with your neighbor, or if anyone wants to kind of throw out, think about, okay, what was this dinosaur doing on top of this nest? What are your possibilities? What kind of situation do we think these dinosaurs were in that laid the nests? Were they, like, was it a colonial nester? Was it a single nester? Was it an animal that cared for their young, or was it an animal that laid an egg and left and never came back? So think about these types of different things, and then I want you to be the paleontologist and tell me what you infer based on your modern animals. Yeah, so, oops. So this is your nest site. So this is all the nests. And then here's your dinosaur and the eggs and all that stuff. So think about that for just a few minutes. Yeah.
Could we also teach them all together?
There are no chicks exposed on the surface. You have eggs, and you have, there's nothing, like when you find a nest, there's no like chick there. It's like in the nest. There's just whole nests, and then there's like this guy. But we don't have any bones right now.
Eating a couple close to their eating it.
Maybe it was off the map.
Why do you think they're all spent for? That's how they're pooping out.
This one? This is how they were found. So it shows like, that they're sticking out.
Maybe there's a bed.
So there's lots of different kind of arrangements of nests So what do we think? What's an idea that you have about this nest site for the dinosaur? Yeah.
That they cook them like penguins, like how, because there's like a bunch of nests in one area, like penguins do what they call their colonization.
Yep. Yeah, so that's a possibility. You have a bunch of nests in one area, colonial nesters is an obvious place to go. You're like, okay, there is a bunch of dinosaurs, they're all nesting together. Kind of got at it actually over here with this question is, are they all the same species of dinosaur is a question you could ask. And that can be, I mean, if they all have the same shape of egg, probably, but sometimes you can't tell 100% right off the bat. A lot of eggs in general have very characteristic shapes and microstructures, so you can sometimes tell, okay, these are definitely from the same dinosaur. So in this case, probably all from the same dinosaur, so yeah, probably a colonial site, could be. What's another thing that people thought about for dinosaurs?
Well, we were talking about going on the theory that maybe they were dumped on by a storm.
Mm-hmm.
If there was only one found, it was probably someone coming to steal the eggs, because if there were people that nested on the eggs, you probably would have caught more of them than this storm.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So like, if it's an animal that is, if there's only one instead of a whole bunch of animals on nests, if it's a sudden storm, then maybe that animal's there to steal something instead of to protect the eggs. And you know, sometimes we can tell what the deposits are. Sometimes these things are like, it's definitely in some kind of sand, so maybe it was a sandstorm. Sometimes it's a dune collapse, where like, you know, just get like a dune that comes and like covers maybe part of the egg, then some of them stay. You know, it's hard to say. So, what's the other idea? Yeah.
Do you know if, like, the nests are all the same age? Like, could it be a situation where, like, some...
They're, like, coming back to the same spot, but maybe... So, yeah, so you can ask that. That's a good question. Like, are some of these old nests, or are some of them new nests? And the best thing to think about that is, if it's a bunch of whole eggs that are all, like, together, then it's probably all the same age. Because if it's an old nest, it's probably just going to be a pile of broken eggshell. For the most part, right? The babies, or at least some eggshells that are broken open. Dinosaurs come out, they leave the nest, or they stay in the nest and they trample the eggshells and they turn them to dust. But you know, you're not going to get whole eggs in that case. Anyone else have other thoughts about this guy, or things that they would want to know? Yeah.
Are you able to tell if it's a male or female just from the fossils?
That's a really good question, and actually I'm going to talk about that when I talk about this specimen specifically, but yes, now we can actually, there are certain things that tell us is this a male or a female, especially when dealing with nesting animals and things like that. Do you have a thought?
If that, the two different, like, the way they're positioned
Mhm.
is quite different, where that's more standing up, those are more kind of, although they're tipped, it looks like
Yeah.
they're laying down, like, mother would sit up in the center type of thing. So could that be a way that you could tell whether or not the mother stayed?
Yeah, possibly. Like, this doesn't look like it's be very fun to sit on, and that's much better. So maybe this is the nest that was being kind of guarded and this one wasn't. It's really hard to tell if the nest was buried by the animal or not, because it's buried by the rocks. So like, it's hard to know if 100% whether just the mother buried it or the rocks or the sand buried it. And it's interesting because like, so if they bury it, they don't usually sit on top of it. But they sometimes do protect it, like alligators still protect their babies in the big buried mounds, yeah.
The fact that the eggs are not hatched,
Yeah.
and there are a lot of them,
Mm-hmm.
suggests to me that one, it wasn't a water event, because they were scattered, so some type of a sandstorm or
Yeah.
something, they covered eggs all at one time,
Mm-hmm.
and that they didn't hatch.
Right, yeah, so these are unhatched. That's actually kind of a good segue. I'm going to tell you about the story of this specimen. So this is the case of, oh, I'm going the wrong way. Okay, there we go. The case of Oviraptor. So this animal is named Oviraptor. Here's the original specimen that I showed you. It's a dinosaur that is laying on top of eggs. When they found this dinosaur, they thought for sure this thing was eating these eggs. It's a predatory dinosaur. You know, there maybe weren't other ones around. I can't actually remember whether this was found on that nesting colony. For the sake of our thought experiment, we said it was. But so they thought this thing was stealing eggs, and they named it Oviraptor, which means egg thief. So right, so it's in its so egg thief Oviraptor. Now, many years later, like 50 or 60 years later, someone decided to look at this thing again, and they took one of these unhatched eggs, and they broke it open, they prepped it out, and they said, what's inside of it? It was a baby Oviraptor. So this thing was probably not there to eat eggs, because the eggs that it was on were eggs of its species, and although, yes, sometimes an animal might steal an egg from the same species, it's less common than like a third party coming in to steal an egg. So we wanted to look more at this thing, and so what they did is they did that thin sectioning of the bone. They looked at it. Turns out that nesting female birds have a very specific type of bone, where their bone gets changed because they have to use a lot of that calcium to make an egg, right? So you have to make an egg, lots of calcium in the shell, so their bones undergo this crazy process, and in order for them to make an egg, and you can see it. Turns out this animal is not a female, all right? This is a male. So you're like, well, maybe it is stealing, right? Except for the fact that male ostriches sit on the nest. All right, this is not unheard of in modern birds. Male ostriches will come and hang out by the nest and guard it. So this is considered now to be an early example of paternal care in dinosaurs. So a male dinosaur sitting on the nest. You can see this is a hand here, and this is a hand here. So the claws are the hands. And you can see it's kind of like circling the nest like that. Another thing that we know about this dinosaur, as you can tell in these two different pictures, that we didn't know back then, was that this dinosaur has wings. So it has feathers, and fairly substantial feathers on its forelimbs. So this type of position where we're kind of encircling, this is something that like ostriches and things like that, assuming the nest, do to protect the nest. They spread out their arms so that they can shade the eggs, so they can protect them from these elements. So you get a dinosaur. Now we know it had a lot of feathers. We know that the eggs were the same species. We know it was male. And so we think, okay, it's actually probably not eating. There's other things about this where it's like, at the time you're like, why didn't they realize that? It's like the legs are all crouched down like it was crouched over the nest and things like this. The position it's in is very much like a brooding bird. And I think partly because when this thing was described, birds weren't dinosaurs. There was no relationship between dinosaurs and birds. So like, why would they think this dinosaur was behaving like a bird? Except for now we know this dinosaur is actually not that distantly related from birds. So turns out it's actually more like a bird than anything else. So that's the case of Oviraptor, and I think is a really interesting way of how our ideas change over time when we get all this new evidence. So that's all the official slides I have for you.
Yeah, so I think we're going to informally end the event right now, but if you have any questions for Dr. Burch after, you can see her for approximately like 15 minutes. I want to thank SUNY Geneseo again for all of their support. I want to thank the Wadsworth Library. Thank you so much for listening to two of our events this fall. And let's thank Dr. Burch. I have one last request. I'm going to have my volunteers in the back with these surveys. It would really, I'd really appreciate it. Really help me out, not only to improve the event, but just to learn some more information about this event. So pens and surveys in the back. If you could just take 2 minutes to fill it out, I'd really appreciate it.